And what's interesting about this is knowing that that's the moment to come, that there's going to be a moment that moves from entering to promise to actually possessing promise. That before that happens, there is a moment of vision. That Joshua himself encounters a vision, a divine vision. And it comes in the form of an angelic figure. And it's one that strikes him as odd. He has to ask the question. He courageously approaches him. Are you with us or are you against us? That's basically what he's saying. Are you with us or are you against us? You are a friend, you are a foe. And the guy says, I'm neither. I'm something bigger. I'm something you can't even comprehend. I am the commander of the Lord's army. And I'm come to this place to lead you. But what's really strange is the instruction he says, because Joshua immediately falls down, he prostrates himself, he begins to worship, and he begins to just praise, and then he says boldly, what is it that you would command of me? What is the call that you bring to me? What is the call that is to come out of this revelation? And he says, of all things, I want you to take off your shoes. I mean, that's what he says. I want you to take off your sandals, for the ground upon which you stand is holy. Now we can look at this moment of revelation where there is vision in this moment of revelation, and we ask the question of what is this really about? What is taking place here? And it's that moment of call, of saying, take off your sandals, for where you stand is holy. That's what we need to put our attention to. That simply means holy, simply means set apart. It means to be set apart. And what we learn in that moment is that what he says to Joshua is, I have taken you out of Egypt. Y'all have gone through the wilderness. You have experienced an entire generation of stuff out there. Now I have gone before you, and I have delivered you into this moment of moving from wilderness to promise. And what you need to realize that where you stand is ground that has been set apart. And the reason that it's been set apart is that your people are set apart. And this is a time in which things will be set apart. So we see a people set apart move to a place that's set apart to take place in a time that is set apart. This is holy, he says. And I want you to take your shoes off so you can connect to it. I want you to be able to feel the ground beneath your feet. I want you to connect to that which is holy. But the same figure has this sword in hand, and it's a symbol of saying what is about to happen is just a further reminder that I am moving out ahead of you and the people you lead. And in the same way that I have gone out before you in the deliverance of Egypt, in the same way that I was ahead of you in that wandering for 40 years, in the same way that I was ahead of you all when I carried you across the Jordan, I will be ahead of you in this time to come, which is to say, this moment of not just entering promise, but this moment of accepting promise, of taking possession of promise. This moment will take place because of what I, God, am about to do. You simply need to follow me. You need to take the courage to boldly come after me. What an amazing, amazing scene. But what really is striking in the midst of it is the way that Joshua responds to the vision. He doesn't retreat from it, does he? Of course not. Rather, he leans into it. And the reason that he's able to receive it is because he's opened himself up to the possibility of it. He receives it because he's prepared to do so. And the reason he's prepared to do so is because one thing Joshua has constantly done is looked in the right direction. He has looked faithfully towards his God. No matter what crazy thing his God has called him to do, or no matter what crazy thing his God has called him, or where he's called him to take the people of Israel, he has followed God. See, the reality is that you have to look in the right direction. Because looking in the right direction, well, that will lead to discovering the right direction. And you have to be able to discover the right direction so that you could then move forward in the right direction. That's the point of what's taking place in what we're reading. What is the direction? To put it into the form of a question, what is the direction that's being supplied by the revelation? In this moment that Joshua shares with this divine figure, there is revelation. But what comes out of this revelation is a call, a direction, how to move forward in a way that seeks God's intention and God's will. And I don't think that that's just a question for Joshua to consider. I think that is very much a question for you and I to discover in our personal lives, but also it is a question for us to consider as a church. What is the direction that is being supplied by the revelation? When God goes out ahead and when God works in advance of us, what is the direction that we are being called to go? And see, over the last couple of weeks, we've discussed two ways that we can bear witness to the faithfulness of God. And we discussed the reasoning for that is so that others can experience the living God. It is about an intentionality on our part to make sure that there is a future generation of Christians that can discover that our God is a living God, but it's also about coming to realize that we have the ability that when we witness to the faithfulness of our God, it points others to a God who has a mighty hand and is awesome. And that's essentially a question that we have to begin to consider. That's our curiosity that's before us. Our curiosity is a question about how we can continue to move forward in the right direction, the one that is determined by God's intention for us as people and as a church. You see, God has been faithful since the very conception. Since the very moment that our church was even thought of, God has been faithful. And we've experienced the blessings of God in numerous ways ever since the beginning of my time here. One thing that I have heard countlessly are the way in which this church has impacted people's lives and the blessings that this church has known. We have an experience of the blessings of God because God has been faithful to us. So how can we move forward in a way that bears witness to God's faithfulness so that others, and not just ourselves, but others can experience the living God? I mean, after all, that's a blessing in and of itself. That's something that we get to participate in. That's something that we get to behold. We get to see God change lives through our very witness. And so that's what I want us to realize in this time of considering stewardship. I know it's a weird conversation to have around stewardship. When we're talking about how is it that we offer ourselves? How is it that we empty ourselves? How is it that we put ourselves out there in the fullest way possible? The first thing that we have to realize is that God is not only present, God is prepared to go before us in the very way that God has been going before us in the past. We cannot move forward, though, without a vision. And the vision that I'm talking about is one that is founded upon God's will and God's revelation. In the past, I've talked about assuming the right posture and assuming the right position. You have to have posture, you have to have position, but you also have to have vision. A vision that is determined by God's revelation. And therefore, we have to be willing to look in the right direction. We must confidently move toward that revelation offered to us. We can't retreat from it. We can't be in fear and move back. We can't stay in a place of frustration. We can't do those things. We have to be able to move into it, to lean into it, to live into that revelation so that we can see the call that is being given to us as a people. And when we lean in, when we discover that we have to be willing to get on our hands and our knees and put our face into the ground and bow before our God and to worship our God and say, you're the only one that matters. And what is it that you would have us do? What is it that you would have us do? So if we're going to be a church, or if we're going to live a life of faith as individuals, either way, if we're going to do those things and we're moving in the right direction, one that bears witness to God's faithfulness so that others can experience the living God, then we need a clear vision, and that vision begins with a responsibility on our part. We must be willing to look towards God. And then we must approach God with confidence. We must humbly bow before God, worship God, and offer ourselves to God. And finally, the hardest thing of all, we must be courageous. We must be courageous to do as God commands us to do. So I'm going to invite the band to come back up. What I want to leave you with is that we all realize that God is not done with this church. God has never been done with this church. We will continue to see the great things that God has in store. God is still present and prepared to move before us. But what I've said all along during this string of sermons is that I'm going to challenge you. That's the stewardship part of this. I'm going to challenge you. And this week I'm going to challenge you too. I want to challenge you as you leave. I really want to leave you with something to think about. And the challenge I want to leave you with today is to consider how we can continue in the right direction that is based off a clear vision of God's will for our church and for our lives. The challenge then becomes whether or not you're willing to seek that vision and to lean into God's vision supplied by God's revelation. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.